hidden in the attic so the suitor would take her pretty sister. A Lakota chief saw her first. The axe handle split on me that morning. I remember that because I'd had it since before the war with the bluecoats, since my father's time, and the grain had finally gone soft at the throat where the steel seated. I was standing behind the trading post in Millhaven, trying to split cord wood for the widow Pelletier in exchange for her letting me water my horses from her trough, when it gave. Clean snap. The two halves of the handle fell in the dirt, and I stood there holding the head in both hands, the iron still warm from the work, and I thought, some things just reach the end of their usefulness, and there's no shame in it. I was 51 years old. My hair had gone iron gray at the temples. The scar that ran from my left ear to the corner of my jaw, a crow blade, 15 years prior had faded to silver. My knees ached in cold weather, and the cold weather was coming. I had led men into battle. I had sat in council with men who tried to take everything from us, and I had not flinched. And I was standing behind a trading post in a town that barely tolerated my presence, holding a broken axe head, and I thought that too. Let me tell you something about Millhaven in those years. It was a town that had decided what it was going to be, and what it had decided was white, prosperous, and orderly. There was a land office and a church and a hotel with actual glass in the windows. The Lakota, my people, had a kind of grudging permission to trade there, nothing more. The men watched us when we came in. The women pulled their children close. The marshal, a man named Gettins with a red face and small eyes, had a way of standing in the middle of the main street when we rode through, hands loose at his sides, not exactly threatening but not exactly not. I came in alone mostly. I had stopped coming in with a group of men because a group of us made the town go rigid, and I had business to conduct, pelts sometimes, or horse trading, and I didn't need the trouble. My name in Lakota doesn't translate cleanly to English. The traders called me Gray Wolf. The marshal called me Chief, the way some men say sir and mean the opposite of respect. I answered to both. I had learned that what men call you and what you are have very little to do with each other. I found a new axe handle at the hardware. Old Benner's son, the father had died 2 winters prior, sold it to me without speaking, took my coin off the counter without touching my hand, and turned back to his ledger. I was accustomed to this. I fit the handle in the store's doorway, testing the grip, and then I went back around to the widow Pelletier's yard, and I finished the wood. That is when I heard her. Not crying. I want to be clear about that, because crying would have meant something was broken or urgent, and what I heard wasn't either of those things. It was more like a woman talking to herself, low and steady, the way you talk when you're working through something that makes you furious and you don't have anyone to be furious at. I came around the corner of the woodpile, and I looked up at the building next door, which was a 2-story house with a narrow window cut into the eave, barely more than a vent, and there was a face up there. Young, pale, dark hair pulled back tight. She had her elbows on the sill, and she was talking at something I couldn't see, the yard below her, the street beyond, the general unfairness of the world, I couldn't tell. Then she looked down and saw me looking up, and she stopped. We stared at each other for a moment. She didn't pull back from the window, which I noted. Most women in Millhaven, if they found a Lakota man looking at them, they'd step back fast. She didn't. She just studied me the way you'd study something you hadn't expected to find. "You're the one they call Gray Wolf," she said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "You were splitting wood for the widow." "Yes." She looked at me another moment. Then she said, "I've been up here since yesterday morning," in the tone of someone stating a fact that is also an injustice. I didn't know what to do with that. I said, "Why?" "Because my mother put me here," she said. "Mr. Aldrich is coming to call on my sister, and my mother didn't want him confused." I stood there with the axe in my hand. "Confused," I said. "Margaret is the pretty one," she said simply, without venom. "The way you say the sky is blue. I confuse suitors. They can't decide which one they want, and then nobody gets chosen, and my mother considers that a catastrophe." She paused. I have a chamber pot and a book about the migratory habits of North American birds. My name is Nora." I didn't laugh. I wanted to. Something shifted in my chest, not tenderness exactly, not yet, more like recognition. I had been made invisible by people who found my presence inconvenient. I knew that feeling. I knew it in my bones. "Nora," I said. "Gray Wolf," she said. "Caleb," I told her. It was the name the missionaries had given me at the school when I was 8, and I hadn't used it in years. And I didn't entirely know why I gave it to her, except that Gray Wolf felt like a costume just then, and I didn't want to wear it. She just said it once, quietly trying it out. Then she looked down at the axe. "Did you fix the handle?" she said. "New handle," I said. "Old head." She thought about that. "That seems about right," she said. "The valuable part usually survives." I thought about that all the rest of that day. I came back the next morning. I told myself I had more wood to split. There wasn't more wood. I had split every piece the widow had, and she'd paid me in a pot of venison stew and her husband's old winter coat, which was too short in the arm but warm. I came back and I stood in that yard and I looked up at the window and she was there, the book in her hand. "He chose Margaret," she said before I could speak. "He's coming to dinner tonight to make it official. I'll be allowed downstairs." "Good," I said. "I suppose." She set the book on the sill. "I'm not sure whether to be insulted or relieved. I think both." She looked at me. "Do you know what it is to be the one people arrange around? Like a piece of furniture that's in an inconvenient spot." I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. "I imagine you do." That was the thing. She didn't say it with pity. She said it the way you acknowledge something real, something that belongs in the world alongside everything else real. I had been pitied by missionaries and by government men who thought pity was the same thing as respect. This wasn't pity. This was just seeing. "What's in the book?" I said. Her face changed. "You actually want to know?" "Yes." She told me. For half an hour she told me about the migration patterns of the sandhill crane, about how they traveled thousands of miles and returned to the same ground year after year, not out of habit, but out of something that looked, she said, almost like loyalty. She said she'd read the chapter 4 times since yesterday morning. She said she found it, she hesitated on the word, comforting. I sat on the woodpile and I listened. I could hear the town around us, a wagon on the street, someone calling to someone, a dog, and I sat there and I listened to this woman talk about cranes, and I thought, when is the last time someone talked to me like I was just a person in a yard? I couldn't remember. 3 weeks passed. I want to be honest about what those 3 weeks were, and were not. I came to Millhaven 4 more times. Twice I had genuine business. A horse to sell to a man named Fourier who always paid fair and didn't make a ceremony of it. Twice I had no business at all. I came in off the plains in the gray early morning when the town was still half asleep, and I rode past the house, and sometimes she was in the front yard with a basket of washing, and sometimes she wasn't. And on the times she wasn't I told myself it was fine, and on the times she was I stayed longer than I needed to. We talked about all manner of things. She was curious in the way that a person gets curious when they've been kept in a small space, not the narrow curiosity of a person who wants to seem educated, but a real appetite, a hunger to understand how things actually worked. She asked about the plains, about how we read weather, about the horses. She asked questions that told me she'd been thinking about the answers before she asked. I told her more than I had told anyone in years. She told me things too. Her father had died when she was 12, some fever that came through fast and took him in 2 weeks. Her mother had never recovered from the shock of being alone, which had made her fierce and small and desperate for her daughters to marry well. Margaret was 17 and bride-eyed and the plan was working. Nora was 23 and, as she said it, outside the plan. "Do you mind?" I asked her once. She thought about it honestly. I mind that I wasn't asked, she said. Whether I mind the outcome, I'm not sure yet. I respected that answer. I respected it very much. What I did not do in those 3 weeks was tell her anything about what was forming in my chest. A man of 51 does not say such things quickly. A man who has watched 2 wives die, one in childbirth, one in the fever year of 1864, does not say such things easily. I had closed those doors a long time ago, and I had told myself they were closed for good reason, and I had believed it. But I thought about her on the ride back to camp. I thought about the way she'd described the cranes. I thought about her saying the valuable part usually survives, and how she'd said it without knowing she was describing both of us. The trouble came on a Tuesday. I didn't see it happen. I only heard it from Fourier, who told me the next time I came to sell horses, his face careful and neutral the way he got when he had bad news. Gettens, the marshal, had gone to Nora's mother, had told her that her daughter, the older one, the plain one, had been seen talking to the Lakota chief from the North Territory, and that it wasn't right, and that it needed to stop. Fourier said he didn't know what the mother had done exactly, but that the older daughter hadn't been outside in a week. I sat with that. Fourier said carefully, "I don't know that there's much to be done, Caleb." I said no. He said, "Gettens is looking for a reason. He's that kind of man." I said, "I know what kind of man he is." I rode out of Millhaven that afternoon and I went back to camp, and I sat by the fire a long time. My nephew, my sister's boy, Lame Elk, who was 19 and brash in the way that 19-year-old men are brash, sat across from me and watched me and finally said, "Uncle, what is it?" I told him not all of it, enough. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Is she worth it?" I thought about cranes flying 10,000 miles back to the same ground. I thought about a woman in an attic window looking down at me without pulling back. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. "Then you know what you have to do," he said. I said, "I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to get her killed by her neighbors for my sake." He said, "That's not the only option." I did not go back to Millhaven for 11 days. I want to be clear about what those 11 days were. They were not noble. They were not stoic. I was a man in his 50s who had closed himself off for a long time and had been cracked open by a woman he'd barely touched, and the 11 days were bad. On the 6th day, I rode out very early, before the sun was fully up, and I went south toward the river, and I sat on a bluff above the water and I talked to my first wife, which I had not done in years. Her name had been Winona, and she had been smart and stubborn, and she had laughed at things other people thought were serious, and she had died when our son was 3 days old, and the son had died that same week, and I had never. I sat on that bluff for a long time. What I decided, eventually, was this. A man does not honor the dead by making himself into a monument to their absence. A man honors the dead by continuing to be a man worth something. And whether or not Nora was possible, whether the town and the marshal and the century would allow it, I had to know. I rode back to camp, and I told Lame Elk we were going to Millhaven. I went to the house directly, not the yard, not the alley by the woodpile, the front door. Nora's mother answered. She was a thin woman with a face that had been pretty once and was now arranged into permanent wariness. She looked at me the way she'd look at a storm that had come to her door. I said, "My name is Caleb. I'm the man your daughter has been speaking to. I'd like to speak to her again with your knowledge, and I'd like to speak to you about why." She stared at me. I said, "I'm not here to embarrass you or your family. I have land in the North Territory, my own land, documented with the Territorial Office, which I obtained honestly in the treaty negotiations of 1871. I have horses. I have no debt. I have reputation among the men I do business with in this territory, including Thomas Fourier, whom I believe you know. I am asking to court your daughter. Properly. With your knowledge and your permission." Her face was, I don't know, I had expected rage. I had prepared for rage. What I got was something more complicated, something that had fear in it but also a peculiar kind of calculation. She said, she's not the one with prospects. I said, I'm not interested in prospects. I'm interested in Nora. The silence that followed was very long. She said, Marshal Gettens. I said, Marshal Gettens has no authority over what occurs in your home between consenting adults. She said, he'll make trouble. I said, he'll try. Another silence. She was looking at me very carefully now, the calculation deepening. You said you have land, she said. I do. North Territory. 160 acres along the Mara River. Grass, water, timber on the north end, good land. She looked at me for a very long time. I held still. I had sat in treaty negotiations with men who had armies behind them. I could hold still. Finally she said, you'll wait in the parlor. I heard them upstairs. Not the words, just the sound of voices, the mother's sharp and low, Nora's level, and after a moment rising. I sat in the parlor with my hat on my knee and I looked at the room. Embroidered cushions and a tintype of a man I took to be the dead father and a shelf of books that had been read, genuinely read. The spines cracked. Nora came down the stairs alone. She stopped at the bottom and looked at me across the room, and I stood up. She said, my mother says you asked to court me. Yes, I said. She said, she also says you have 160 acres along the Morrow, and you told her this first, which she found very practical and is apparently in your favor. I told her because it was relevant, I said, not because it was the reason. What is the reason? I looked at her. She was standing very straight at the bottom of those stairs, and her hands were clasped in front of her, and her chin was up, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at me from that attic window, not pulling back. I said, you told me the valuable part usually survives. You said it about an axe handle. You didn't know you were also saying it about two people nobody had bothered to look at properly. I paused. I've been looked past for a long time. I think you have too. I don't think that's what either of us deserves. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you came to the front door. Yes. Gettens will hear about it. Yes. You came anyway. Yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she unclenched her hands and she walked across the parlor and she stopped about 2 feet in front of me and she looked up at my face, the scar, the gray at my temples, the 51 years of it, and she didn't look away from any of it. She said, I'd like to see the Morrow River. I said, I'd like to show it to you. She put her hand out, plain and simple, the way you'd seal a bargain, and I took it. And her hand was small and warm and real, and we stood there in her mother's parlor in Millhaven with the whole town outside the window, and I felt something open in my chest that I had thought was sealed shut. I will tell you about Gettens, because it would be dishonest not to. He came to the house 2 days later. I wasn't there. I'd gone back to camp to make arrangements, to tell my people what I'd done, to let Lame Elk look smug and say he'd told me. But Nora told me about it later, sitting beside me on the bank of the Morrow, her boots off and her feet in the cold water. Gettens had come to the door and he'd spoken to the mother, and then the mother had called Nora down, and Nora had come down and stood in the hallway and Gettens had told her. She said he'd been almost gentle about it, which was its own kind of threat, that she ought to think very carefully about the kind of life she was signing up for. That Millhaven wouldn't accept it. That people would make things difficult. She said she'd looked at him for a while, and then she said, Mr. Gettens, I've spent 23 years in this town being arranged around like inconvenient furniture. I believe I'm capable of handling difficult. She said he'd left without another word. I sat there on the bank of the Morrow, and I listened to her tell it, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing I saw from that yard. She'd been hidden and overlooked and shelved, and she had a spine in her made of something harder than whatever the town was made of, And she'd been waiting, not for rescue, not for a man to come save her. She'd been waiting for something worth walking toward. That's a different thing. I want to be clear about that. I did not rescue Nora. Nora made a choice. A free one with her eyes open to every consequence. That is the only kind of choosing that matters. I looked at her sitting there with her feet in the water and the cottonwoods dropping their seeds around us in the still air, and I thought that I had done a great many things in my life. I had fought and lost and survived and led men and grieved and kept going, the way you keep going. And I was sitting here now, on land I'd held by my own effort and my own will, and a woman who had been made invisible by the same world that had tried to make me invisible, had looked at me from a window and not pulled back, and had walked across a parlor and put her hand out, and was now telling me about Gettins with her boots off and 3 sandhill cranes moving across the sky to the south. She looked up and saw me watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Cranes." She looked south and she saw them, and something came into her face that I can't name exactly. Not happiness, deeper than that. More like settling. Like a thing returning to the ground it always should have been on. She leaned her shoulder against mine, just that. Just the weight of her, warm and solid against my arm. I looked at those cranes until they were gone. We married in the spring. Not in Millhaven, I won't lie to you and tell you the town came around, because towns like Millhaven do not come around, they just eventually stop being able to stop you. We married in the North Territory on the land with my people and with Fourier and his wife, who drove 3 hours in a wagon to be there, and with the widow Pelletier, who brought a pie and cried. Margaret didn't come. The mother came, which surprised me, and stood very straight through the whole of it, and afterward shook my hand with both of hers. I don't know what that meant to her. I know what it meant to me. Nora learned the land the way she'd learned the bird book, thoroughly, with questions, until she understood how things actually worked. She had opinions about everything. She was not, as I had perhaps half expected, soft or grateful or relieved. She was herself, opinionated and curious and sometimes infuriating in the specific way that a person is infuriating when they are right and you are wrong and both of you know it. I loved her for all of it. There was a morning, our 3rd autumn, when we were out before dawn checking the horses after a hard freeze, and the light came up pink and cold over the river breaks, and she handed me a cup of coffee from the pot she'd carried out in both hands, and she was looking at the light on the water, and she said, without looking at me, "I used to think I was the kind of person nothing interesting was going to happen to." I took the coffee. I looked at the light on the water too. "What do you think now?" I said. She looked at me then. The cold had put color in her face and her breath was smoke in the air, and she was looking at me the way she'd looked at me from that window in Millhaven, from those stairs, across that parlor. Like a woman who has seen something clearly and made her choice and does not require anyone's permission to stand by it. She didn't answer, she just turned back to the river. That was answer enough. The light came up full over the morrow, and I stood there with a warm cup and my wife beside me on 160 acres of ground I'd held by my own 2 hands, and I thought about what my nephew had said. Then you know what you have to do. And I thought about what I'd done. I'd walked to a front door. I'd told a frightened woman the truth. I'd stood still and waited. That's all it was. The cranes came through again that October, passing south. We both saw them.